paralyzed Muggle father. A stolen pureblood fortune. The ultimate betrayal. Watch Severus Snape embrace the darkness and rise as the terrifying half-blood prince. Hit subscribe, drop a like, and comment present to claim your spot before we dive into the shadows. The transatlantic port key, a discarded, rusted hubcap located behind a heavily warded Makusa outpost in New York, dropped Severus Snape back into the suffocating reality of America. The transition from the cool, ancient stone corridors of Hogwarts to the oppressive, yellow-tinged smog of Pennsylvania was a physical blow. It was late June, and the summer heat had already settled over the Rust Belt like a damp, suffocating woolen blanket. Severus stood at the end of Spinner's End, his second-hand Hogwarts trunk resting on the cracked asphalt beside him. He was no longer the terrified, helpless 9-year-old boy who used to hide in the dark, roach-infested pantry beneath the stairs. He was 12 years old, and he had survived his first year in the Serpent's Den of Slytherin House. He had bled James Potter in the courtyard, and he had claimed his mother's ancient, pure-blood legacy as his own title, the Half-Blood Prince. With a flick of his wrist, entirely bypassing the need for his mother's old ebony wand, Severus levitated his heavy trunk a few inches off the ground. He walked down the street, the wheels hovering silently over the broken pavement. The neighborhood was exactly as miserable as he had left it. The peeling paint, the distant, relentless thumping of the steel mill down by the river, and the air that tasted faintly of copper and sulfur. He stopped in front of number 19. The row house leaned tiredly against its neighbors, looking like a rotting tooth in a dying mouth. Before stepping onto the splintered wooden porch, Severus closed his eyes and extended his senses outward, feeling for the magical tripwires he had woven around the property before leaving for King's Cross last September. He felt the hum of his own magic, a dark, cold resonance vibrating through the foundational bricks. The wards were intact. They had not been breached, which meant the conditional curses he had tied to them had not been triggered. His father, Tobias Snape, had not raised a hand against Eileen in 9 months. Severus opened his eyes, a thin, cruel smile playing on his pale lips. The Muggle had obeyed. He pushed open the front door. The house smelled faintly of stale cheap beer and damp wallpaper, but the oppressive, terrifying vibration of impending violence was gone. Instead, the house felt like a tomb. Severus stepped into the dim hallway, his trunk floating obediently behind him. He was not returning home. He was returning to the territory he had conquered. The prince had come to survey his empire. Tobias Snape sat in his worn-out recliner in the living room. The black-and-white television was on, but the volume was muted, casting a flickering, ghostly light over the man's broad, weathered face. When Severus's footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor, Tobias flinched so violently he nearly tipped the chair backward. Severus stopped in the threshold of the living room, his dark, bottomless eyes locking onto his father. Tobias looked significantly older. The aggressive, boisterous cruelty that had once fueled his drunken rages was entirely extinguished. In its place was a hollow, paralyzing terror. The Muggle had never forgotten the feeling of the freezing charm locking his muscles, turning him into a helpless statue on the kitchen linoleum. "Hello, Tobias," Severus said softly. His voice was smooth, quiet, and carried a lethal, silken edge that belonged to a much older, much more dangerous wizard. Tobias swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thick neck. His bloodshot eyes darted from Severus's face to the pockets of his dark robes, undoubtedly searching for the wooden stick that had broken his rule over this house. You're back," Tobias rasped, his voice trembling. "I told you I would return," Severus replied, stepping fully into the room. He did not break eye contact. He wanted the man to feel the weight of his presence. He wanted Tobias to feel the exact same suffocating fear that Eileen had endured for over a decade. Eileen emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a faded floral apron. She looked thinner, her sallow skin stretched tightly over prominent cheekbones, but the fresh bruises that used to paint her jawline were conspicuously absent. "Severus," she breathed, a mixture of relief and deep, underlying anxiety in her voice. "Mother," Severus acknowledged her with a curt nod, but his attention remained fixed on his father. He walked slowly over to the small, cluttered side table next to Tobias's recliner. A half-empty bottle of cheap bourbon sat sweating on the wood. Severus looked at the bottle, then at his father. "You are drinking again." Tobias shrank back into the upholstery, raising his hands defensively as if expecting a physical blow. "It's my house. I pay the rent. You exist in this house because I allow it, Severus corrected, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. He didn't pull his wand. He simply raised his pale, spider-like hand and pointed his index finger at the bottle. Desiring the effect with a practiced, cold focus, Severus shattered the glass. The bourbon bottle exploded into 1,000 glittering shards. The amber liquid splashed violently across Tobias's lap and the side of his face. Tobias let out a pathetic, strangled whimper, clamping his hands over his head and curling into a fetal position in the chair, expecting the kinetic shockwave that had once thrown him across the room. But Severus did nothing more. He simply watched the pathetic display of the broad-shouldered mill worker cowering before an unarmed 12-year-old boy. The power shift was not just intoxicating, it was absolute. "Clean that up," Severus ordered coldly, turning his back on the trembling man. "And if I find another bottle in this house, I will not shatter the glass. I will shatter your jaw." Severus walked toward the narrow, creaking staircase, his trunk floating behind him. He had promised himself that he would exact revenge on the Muggle world that had trapped his mother. Subjugating Tobias Snape was only the first step. Severus refused to spend another year at Hogwarts looking like a charity case. He remembered the agonizing humiliation of standing in Madame Malkin's in Diagon Alley, being fitted for frayed, second-hand robes while Lucius Malfoy sneered at his poverty. The purebloods respected power, but they worshipped wealth. To truly reign as the half-blood prince, Severus needed his own capital, and he refused to rely on the meager Hogwarts financial aid fund allotted to impoverished students. 2 weeks into the sweltering July heat, Severus forced Eileen to take him to the American Magical Underground. Hidden beneath the crumbling, abandoned foundations of a decommissioned steel mill on the outskirts of Cokeworth was a Makusa-monitored trading post known to the locals as the Slag Heap. It was nothing like the whimsical, bustling charm of Diagon Alley. The Slag Heap was a gritty, subterranean corridor illuminated by flickering gas lamps and floating orbs of swamp fire. The air was thick with the smell of rust, illicit potion ingredients, and the desperate sweat of working-class wizards who had been cast out of the polished echelons of Makusa society. Severus walked through the damp, stone-lined tunnels, a heavy canvas satchel slung over his shoulder. Eileen walked nervously behind him, her head down, clutching her threadbare shawl. She was terrified of this place, but Severus moved with a predatory confidence. He approached a rusted iron door guarded by a massive, scarred wizard with a missing eye. After Eileen muttered the password, they were granted entry into a dimly lit apothecary that smelled strongly of decay and dried blood. The shopkeeper, a wizened old man with a face like a dried apple, leaned over the counter. "What do you want, Eileen? I don't give credit to the disowned." "She isn't buying," Severus stepped forward, placing his canvas satchel heavily onto the wooden counter. "I am selling." The old man looked down at the pale, scowling boy in oversized Muggle clothes and barked a rough laugh. "And what exactly does a boy from the gutters have to sell me?" Severus unbuckled the satchel and pulled out 6 small, perfectly corked glass vials. The liquid inside shimmered with a dangerous, oily iridescence. During his late nights locked in the stifling rowhouse attic, Severus had not only practiced hexes, he had applied his obsessive brilliance to the art of potion-making. "This is a modified draft of peace," Severus said, his voice entirely devoid of childish hesitation. "The standard recipe requires powdered moonstone and syrup of hellebore. I substituted the hellebore with a carefully measured infusion of dried belladonna and crushed ashwinder eggs. It doesn't just calm the nerves. It completely deadens the pain receptors for exactly 4 hours without inducing sleep." The shopkeeper's sneer vanished. He picked up one of the vials, holding it up to the flickering gaslight, his one good eye widening as he noted the flawless consistency and the absolute lack of sediment. It was professional-grade brewing, highly illegal under strict Makusa regulations, and incredibly valuable to the unsavory clientele of the Slag Heap who routinely engaged in dark magic duels. "You brewed this?" the old man asked, a tone of deep suspicion replacing his mockery. "I did," Severus lied smoothly, knowing the man would never believe a 12-year-old was capable of such complex, volatile chemistry. "My mother brewed it under my instruction." Her hands shake too much to measure the belladonna correctly. Eileen looked at the floor, saying nothing. The shopkeeper uncorked the vial, wafting the scent toward his nose. He nodded slowly, clearly impressed by the lethal perfection of the brew. "I'll give you 10 dragons for the lot." 50 dragons, Severus countered instantly, his dark eyes flashing with unyielding authority. Or I will take my supply to the nocturne markets in Philadelphia. You know exactly what these are worth to your buyers. Do not attempt to insult my intelligence because of my age." The old man glared at him. A silent battle of wills fought over the stained wooden counter. Finally, the shopkeeper grunted, reaching beneath the counter and pulling out a heavy leather pouch. He counted out 50 heavy, gold American dragons and slid them across the table. Severus swept the coins into his pocket. He had secured his independence. He would buy his own pristine robes, his own new textbooks, and his own rare ingredients. The prince was building his arsenal, and he would use the filth of the American underground to finance his war in Britain. The attic of number 19 was a suffocating oven. The July sun beat down on the slate roof, baking the small, unfinished crawlspace until the air smelled of hot dust and dead wasps. For Severus, the heat was entirely irrelevant. This dusty, forgotten room was his sanctuary, his laboratory, and his war room. He sat cross-legged on the rough wooden floorboards, surrounded by his mother's old, heavy leather-bound books. A single, stolen flashlight illuminated the space, its beam cutting through the thick dust motes dancing in the heavy air. In his lap rested the blank, leather-bound journal he had purchased in Diagon Alley at the end of his first year. He opened it to the very first page. The parchment was pristine, heavy, and waiting for a legacy. He unstoppered his inkwell and dipped his quill. With sharp, elegant, and merciless handwriting, he traced over the words he had written in the Great Hall. "This book is the property of the half-blood prince." Severus stared at the title. It was his anchor. It reminded him that he was not the dirt on James Potter's shoe, nor was he the tragic, beaten son of Tobias Snape. He was a weapon forged in the dark. He turned to the next blank page. His mind buzzed with the chaotic, violent energy of the dark arts. He thought back to the courtyard at Hogwarts, the pale, watery spring sun, and the look of absolute shock on James Potter's face as the purple light struck his cheekbone. Secare. Severus wrote the incantation down. It was a crude, unfinished prototype. It had acted like a physical blade, but the magic had been unstable, requiring too much raw emotional output to channel properly. If he was going to survive the organized, relentless bullying of the marauders, if he was going to destroy them, he needed a spell that was efficient, silent, and lethal. He pulled a compendium of hexes, jinxes, and minor curses toward him. He cross-referenced the wand movements for standard severing charms with the ancient, blood magic theories his mother had hidden away. He scribbled notes furiously into the margins of his new journal, slashing out failed theories and rewriting incantations. Desire the effect. He needed a live target to test the modifications. Severus set his quill down and picked up his mother's ebony wand. He crept toward the darkest corner of the attic, where the moldy cardboard boxes were piled high. The faint scratching sound of a rat scurrying along the rafters caught his attention. Severus pointed his wand into the shadows. He didn't want to just push the creature. He wanted to slice through it. He wanted to perfect the invisible blade. He focused on his hatred for the marauders, for his father, and for the Muggles who had mocked him. Sectum sempra, Severus whispered. It was a new word, a darker, sharper evolution of his previous spell. Always sever. He slashed the wand downward in a vicious diagonal arc. A flash of bright, blindingly harsh white light erupted from the tip of the ebony wand. There was no kinetic thud this time. There was only a sickening, wet slicing sound. Severus clicked on his flashlight and aimed it at the corner. The large gray rat lay on the floorboards, completely bisected. Blood pooled rapidly onto the dry wood, sinking into the rot. Severus lowered his wand, his chest heaving. The sheer, devastating power of the curse sent a terrifying thrill straight down his spine. He had created something entirely new. He had forged dark magic out of his own pain and hatred. He walked back to his journal, his hands trembling slightly with the adrenaline of creation, and carefully documented the exact wand movement and the precise emotional intent required to cast Sectum Sempra. He was building an arsenal, spell by spell. When he returned to Hogwarts, the marauders would not face a frightened boy from the slums. They would face a prince armed with a guillotine. Despite the suffocating heat and the dark magic consuming his nights, Severus found himself drawn to the decaying infrastructure of the town. He walked along the rusted railroad tracks where the freight trains used to haul coal, his oversized black coat replaced by a crisp black button-down shirt he had bought with his newly earned dragons. He walked toward the small, neglected playground bordered by the rusted chain-link fence. It was the sanctuary where he had first claimed Lily Evans as an ally. where he had first told her about the magical world, promising that they would conquer it side by side. He stopped behind a massive, graffiti-covered oak tree, keeping himself hidden in the heavy shadows. Lily was there. She was sitting on the squeaking swing, her bright, fiery red hair a stark, beautiful contrast to the gray, dying world of Cokeworth. She was not practicing accidental magic or making wilted flowers bloom. Instead, she had a large piece of heavy parchment balanced on her knees, and she was writing furiously with a quill. Perched on the top bar of the swing set, looking entirely out of place in the industrial smog, was a handsome tawny owl. Severus felt a cold, jagged spike of jealousy pierce his chest. She wasn't writing to him. They hadn't spoken since the end-of-year feast, when he had watched her laughing with James Potter across the great hall. He strained his eyes, watching her dip the quill into her inkwell. Her face was lit up with a genuine, bright smile. She was writing to them, to the Gryffindors, to the boys who had mocked his poverty, who had named him Snevellis, and who treated magic like a birthright to be squandered on pranks and cruelty. For a single, desperate moment, Severus stepped out from behind the oak tree. He wanted to breach the chain-link fence. He wanted to walk up to her, to demand her attention, to apologize for his dark spells, and to pull her back into the fragile sanctuary they had built. He wanted to show her that he was powerful now, that he had his own money, and that he could protect her. But as he took a step forward, the memory of the Sorting Hat's dry, ancient voice echoed in his mind. "I see a great deal of pain. You want to punish them, don't you? The path of vengeance is a lonely one. It will consume everything you hold dear." Severus stopped. He looked at Lily's smiling face as she tied the finished letter to the owl's leg. He looked at his own pale hands, the same hands that had just sliced a living creature in half with a newly invented dark curse. He realized with a crushing, absolute certainty that they were no longer walking the same path. Lily was tethered to the light, to the easy, arrogant joy of Gryffindor House. Severus was tethered to the dark, to the vicious politics of Slytherin, and to a sworn vengeance against the Muggle world and the privileged purebloods who had ruined his mother's legacy. If he approached her now, he would have to surrender his power. He would have to swallow his pride, accept the marauder's bullying, and pretend that the world was fair. Severus Snape refused to be a victim ever again. He turned his back on the playground, leaving the brilliant red-haired girl to her letters and her new friends. He walked back toward the suffocating darkness of Spinner's End, his heart locked away in a vault of iron and ice. He had chosen his path. The iron summer had hardened him into a weapon, and he was ready for war. The return to the Scottish Highlands was entirely different from his first journey. Severus Snape did not press his face against the glass of the Hogwarts Express in awe, nor did he search desperately for an empty compartment to share with a red-haired girl. He sat alone in a carriage near the rear of the train, the heavy door locked and warded with a localized locking charm he had perfected over the brutal Pennsylvania summer. He wore brand-new, impeccably tailored black robes purchased with the American dragons he had earned in the slag heap. They fit his thin frame perfectly, casting off the shadow of the impoverished, ragged boy from Cokeworth. When the massive oak doors of the great hall swung open for the start-of-term feast, Severus did not walk with the nervous hesitation of the other second-year students. He moved with a cold, predatory glide, his spine rigid, his dark, bottomless eyes sweeping over the 4 long tables. The great hall was an explosion of sound and light. Thousands of candles floated beneath the enchanted ceiling, which currently mirrored a clear, brilliant night sky. The Gryffindor table was, as always, a riot of obnoxious noise. Severus took his seat near the middle of the Slytherin table, surrounded by the silver and green banners that felt more like a battle standard than a school decoration. Avery and Mulciber, the boys who had mocked his poverty the previous year, slid down the bench to give him a wide berth. They remembered the sting of his wandless magic. They recognized the dangerous, predatory stillness he had brought back with him from America. Severus picked up his silver goblet, his eyes drifting across the sea of students until they locked onto the Gryffindor table. There she was, Lily Evans. Her fiery red hair caught the golden candlelight, making her look radiant and entirely untouchable. She was laughing, her bright green eyes crinkling at the corners. And sitting directly beside her, leaning in with an arrogant, easy charm, was James Potter. Severus's grip on the silver goblet tightened until his knuckles turned bone white. James turned his head to laugh at something Sirius Black had said, catching the candlelight on the right side of his face. There, slashing across his cheekbone and narrowly missing his eye, was a stark, white, jagged scar. It was the permanent reminder of Severus's Sicaire curse. Severus had expected the scar to be a mark of shame. He had wanted it to be a humiliating brand that proved Potter was not invincible. Instead, James wore the scar like a badge of honor. He saw the way the older Gryffindor girls looked at it, whispering and giggling. He saw how James purposefully angled his face, using the mark of Severus's dark magic to make himself look rugged, brave, and heroic. A sickening, corrosive wave of fury washed over Severus, burning like acid in his throat. He had drawn the Golden Boy's blood, and the world had somehow twisted it to make Potter even more beloved. The Muggle world rewarded cruelty with fear. The magical world, Severus realized with absolute clarity, rewarded arrogance with adoration. Laugh while you can, Potter, Severus thought, his dark eyes narrowing into slits of pure, unadulterated venom. He lowered his goblet, untasting the pumpkin juice inside. A scar is only a warning. The next time I strike, there will be nothing left to heal. The Slytherin common room was a subterranean fortress. Located deep beneath the Black Lake, the rough-hewn stone walls sweated with dampness, and the heavy, ornate lamps cast a perpetual, sickly green glow over the leather armchairs. It was a space designed for secrets, for whispers, and for the cultivation of power. Severus sat in the darkest corner of the room, far from the roaring fireplace, his nose buried in his leather-bound journal. He was currently mapping out the arithmancy required to stabilize the Sectum Semper curse, ensuring the magical backlash wouldn't sever his own wand arm. Fascinating reading, Snape. Severus snapped the journal shut instinctively, his hand flying to the ebony wand concealed in his sleeve. He looked up. Standing over him, leaning casually on a silver-headed walking stick, was Lucius Malfoy. Malfoy was now a 7th year, wearing the gleaming silver badge of head boy on his immaculate robes. His pale blonde hair fell perfectly around his sharp, aristocratic face. Malfoy didn't look offended by Severus's defensive reaction. Rather, he looked deeply amused. Relax. I have no interest in confiscating the scribblings of a 2nd year. Though, judging by the ink stains on your fingers and the rather intense look in your eye, I doubt you are doing your charm's homework. I am studying, Severus said, his voice flat, completely devoid of the deference lower-year students usually afforded the head boy. Malfoy's smirk widened. He pulled up a heavy, high-backed chair and sat down across from Severus, crossing his long legs. You returned to us changed, Severus. Last year, you were a rat backed into a corner, lashing out because you were terrified. This year, you look like you are hunting. Malfoy leaned forward, his pale gray eyes dropping their casual amusement, replaced by a cold, appraising intensity. Avery tells me you purchased new robes. He says you walk around the dungeons as if you own them. And the rumor among the prefects is that the scar on Potter's face is your handiwork. Potter is a fool, Severus replied softly, refusing to confirm or deny the accusation. Potter is a blood traitor and a nuisance, Malfoy corrected smoothly. But he is wealthy and he is popular. Brute force will only get you so far against boys like him. If you truly wish to crush the Gryffindor elite, you need more than just a quick wand. You need philosophy. You need allies who understand that power belongs to those who are willing to take it, regardless of the ministry's pathetic restrictions. Severus stared at the older boy. He recognized the tone. It was the same tone the dark wizards in the American Slag Heap used when negotiating the price of illegal curses. Malfoy stood up, smoothing his pristine robes. There is a gathering tomorrow night. Midnight. An empty classroom on the 4th floor. Some of our more ambitious upperclassmen meet to discuss certain realities of our world. Realities concerning the squandering of pureblood heritage and the necessary rise of a new order. Malfoy looked down at the leather-bound journal clutched in Severus's hands. Bring your intellect, Snape. The Dark Lord's cause is always looking for exceptional talent. Do not waste your potential fighting playground skirmishes. As Malfoy swept away toward the boys' dormitories, Severus traced the cover of his journal. The Dark Lord. The name had been whispered in his mother's old texts, a rising phantom of absolute pureblood supremacy. Severus didn't care about the politics of blood purity. Not truly. He was a half-blood himself, tainted by the Muggle filth of Spinner's End. But he cared about power. He cared about an ideology that promised to tear down the arrogant, the privileged, and the weak. If Malfoy's circles could provide him with the arsenal he needed to destroy James Potter and exact his ultimate vengeance, Severus would gladly step into the shadows. The Hogwarts library was a sanctuary of a different kind. It smelled of dry parchment, ancient leather bindings, and polished wood. Severus spent most of his free periods hidden deep within the restricted section's perimeter, practically vibrating with the desire to access the locked grilles that held the darkest magical theories. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when he finally cornered her. Lily Evans was sitting alone at a small, oak table near the section on advanced transfiguration. She was surrounded by towering stacks of books, her quills scratching furiously across a scroll of parchment. The pale, gray light from the rain-lashed windows illuminated the bright, fiery halo of her hair. Severus stood at the end of the aisle, his heart hammering a sudden, frantic rhythm against his ribs. For a moment, the cold, calculating armor of the half-blood prince fractured, revealing the desperate, lonely boy from Cokeworth. He took a deep breath, pushing the weakness down, and stepped out of the shadows. Lily. She jumped slightly, her quill digging a heavy blot of ink into her parchment. She looked up. The warm, open smile she had been wearing just moments before vanished instantly, replaced by a guarded, deeply sorrowful expression that cut Severus worse than any physical curse. "Severus," she said quietly, her green eyes scanning his new robes, the dark circles under his eyes, and the rigid, tense posture of his shoulders. "I haven't seen you since we got back." "You haven't been looking," Severus replied, the bitterness bleeding into his voice despite his efforts to remain entirely cold. He pulled out a chair opposite her and sat down. "You have been too busy holding court with Potter and Black." Lily sighed, closing her Transfiguration textbook with a heavy thud. "Don't do this, Sev. Don't start." "Start what?" Severus leaned forward, his dark eyes locking onto hers, intense and demanding. "Stating the truth? They are arrogant, bullying swine. They strut around this castle as if they own it, and you follow them around like some sort of groupie." "I do not." Lily's voice rose slightly, defensive and flushed. "They are my friends. They are brave, and they are funny, and they don't spend their entire lives sulking in the dungeons practicing dark, horrible magic." The words hit him like a physical blow. "Dark, horrible magic. The magic I practice is necessary," Severus hissed, his hands curling into tight fists on his lap. "You think this world is a fairy tale, Lily. You think because you are a witch, you are safe. You aren't. People like Potter. They only tolerate you because they find you amusing. The moment you cross them, the moment you lack the power to defend yourself, they will crush you just like the Muggles back home." Lily stared at him, her bright green eyes swimming with a mixture of pity and profound disappointment. "James isn't like your father, Severus. And he isn't like Petunia. You are so blinded by your own hatred that you can't see the difference." "I see exactly what he is," Severus snapped, the memory of the white scar on Potter's face burning in his mind. "He is an arrogant, wealthy brat who needs to be taught a lesson." "And you're going to be the one to teach him?" Lily asked, her voice dropping to an incredibly sad whisper. "I saw what you did to his face, Sev. Everyone knows it was you. That wasn't self-defense. That was cruel. That was dark. It was power," Severus said, his voice raw with a desperate need for her to understand. "It is the only thing they respect. I am building something, Lily. I am going to be greater than all of them. Come with me. Leave the Gryffindors. We promised we would conquer this world together." Lily slowly shook her head, a single, tragic tear escaping and tracking down her cheek. "I don't want to conquer the world, Severus. I just want to live in it. And the path you are walking, I can't follow you down there." She stood up, gathering her books into her satchel with trembling hands. She looked down at him one last time, her beautiful face a mask of sorrow. "You're scaring me, Sev. You're turning into exactly what you hate." She turned and walked away, disappearing into the labyrinth of towering bookshelves. Severus sat perfectly still in the dim, dusty light of the library. The silence around him was absolute, deafening. The fragile sanctuary they had built in the rusted ruins of America was completely shattered. He was entirely alone. But as the heartbreak settled, it rapidly calcified into a cold, unyielding rage. If Lily chose the golden boys of Gryffindor over the half-blood prince, then he would simply have to destroy them. He would tear down the sun just to prove that the shadows were stronger. The war with the Marauders was not a series of formal duels. It was a vicious, unrelenting guerrilla campaign fought in the corridors, the courtyards, and the classrooms of Hogwarts. James Potter and Sirius Black were brilliant, wealthy, and entirely ruthless in their pursuit of entertainment. They viewed Severus not just as a rival, but as a disgusting anomaly that needed to be eradicated from their pristine magical world. A week after the library confrontation, Severus was walking back from the greenhouses, his arms laden with heavy pots of venomous tentacula cuttings. The corridors were mostly empty, the late afternoon sun casting long, twisted shadows across the stone floors. Suddenly, the floor beneath his feet simply vanished. Severus pitched forward, crying out in shock as the heavy clay pots shattered against the stone. He was dangling upside down in midair, suspended by his ankle by an invisible, magical rope. His black robes fell over his head, exposing his thin, pale legs and his worn gray undergarments to the damp draft of the corridor. Loud, barking laughter echoed from the suit of armor a few feet away. James Potter and Sirius Black stepped out of hiding, their wands drawn and pointing directly at him. "Look at this, Padfoot," James crowed, pushing his glasses up his nose. "A giant greasy bat hanging from the ceiling. Think we should put him in a cage." "I think we should wash him," Sirius sneered, flicking his wand. A jet of freezing, soapy water erupted from the tip, blasting Severus squarely in the face. Severus choked and sputtered, the stinging soap burning his eyes. The humiliation was absolute, a visceral, burning agony that mirrored every terrifying moment of weakness he had ever experienced in Cokeworth. He thrashed wildly, his hand desperately trying to reach the ebony wand tucked into his robes, but gravity and the heavy fabric fought against him. "Let me down," Severus roared, his voice cracking with rage. "Say please, Snavellis," James taunted, stepping closer and jabbing his wand into Severus's ribs. "Beg for it." Severus didn't beg. He closed his eyes, ignoring the burning soap and the rushing blood in his head. He bypassed his wand entirely. He channeled the cold, black fury burning in his chest, pulling on the raw, chaotic magic that had thrown his father against a wall. Desire the effect. A massive, invisible kinetic shockwave exploded outward from Severus's suspended body. The sheer force of the wandless magic shattered the nearby stained glass window, showering the corridor in a deadly rain of colorful shards. James and Sirius were violently thrown backward, their laughter abruptly turning into shouts of panic as they scrambled to cast shield charms against the flying glass. The disruption of concentration broke the levitation jinx. Severus plummeted to the floor, landing hard on his shoulder with a sickening crunch. He didn't scream. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the agonizing pain, his ebony wand now firmly in his grasp. He pointed it directly at James, who was bleeding from a minor cut on his forehead. Before Severus could unleash the Sectum Semper curse he was dying to test, the heavy footsteps of Professor Slughorn echoed down the corridor, drawn by the sound of shattering glass. The marauders instantly bolted, disappearing down a secret passageway behind a tapestry, leaving Severus standing alone amidst the broken clay, the crushed plants, and the ruined window. That night, in the suffocating silence of the Slytherin dormitory, Severus sat on his bed with the curtains drawn tight. His shoulder throbbed with a dull, agonizing ache, poorly healed by his own amateur mending charms. He opened his leather-bound journal. The marauders were organized. They coordinated their attacks, and worse, they constantly spied on him, trying to uncover his defensive strategies before he could deploy them. He needed a way to plot his vengeance without the walls listening. He dipped his quill into the inkwell. He began to draft the theoretical framework for a completely original spell. He needed an auditory manipulation charm, something that didn't just silence an area, but actively confused the listeners, preventing anyone from eavesdropping on his dark conjurations or his clandestine meetings with Malfoy's circles. He worked through the night, crossing out Latin roots and arithmetic equations, his mind operating with a terrifying, singular focus. By dawn, the ink was dry on a brand new page. Muffliato, a spell designed to fill the ears of anyone in the immediate vicinity with an unidentifiable, persistent buzzing noise. It was a shield forged of sound. With this, the half-blood prince could plot the destruction of his enemies in plain sight, and the golden boys of Gryffindor would never hear the blade coming until it was already buried in their backs. The point of no return arrived on a brisk, wind-swept day in November. The courtyard was packed with students bundled in heavy winter cloaks, hurrying between classes or shivering near the stone fountains. Severus was walking alone, his head down, mentally reciting the complex potion ingredients required for a localized paralysis draft he intended to slip into Potter's pumpkin juice. Make way for the noble house of Black." The mocking, aristocratic shout cut through the howling wind. Severus stopped. Sirius Black was parading through the center of the courtyard, flanked by James and an incredibly nervous-looking Peter Pettigrew. Sirius was holding a beautiful, ornate silver pocket watch high in the air, loudly bragging to a group of swooning Ravenclaw girls about its goblin-wrought history and its priceless value. It was a vulgar, obnoxious display of pure-blood wealth and untouchable privilege. Severus looked at Sirius Black. He saw the casual elegance, the aristocratic bone structure, and the absolute certainty that the world existed merely to applaud his existence. He saw the families who had cast his mother out into the Muggle filth, who sat in their manors counting galleons while Eileen Snape bled on a yellowed linoleum floor. The simmering rage that had been boiling inside Severus since the summer finally erupted. It was a cold, sharp, and entirely focused detonation. He was tired of hiding. He was tired of defensive charms and invisible buzzing. He wanted to make a public statement. He wanted to prove that the blood of the princes, even half-tainted, was infinitely deadlier than the pampered blood of the Blacks. Severus stepped out from the shadow of the colonnade, walking directly into the center of the courtyard. He didn't draw his wand immediately. He simply walked towards Sirius with a terrifying, unblinking focus. The surrounding students noticed the predatory glide of the Slytherin outcast. The chatter died down, replaced by a tense, nervous silence. James Potter noticed him first, his hand instantly dropping to his wand pocket, his hazel eyes narrowing behind his glasses. "What do you want, Snavellis?" Sirius asked, lowering his silver watch, a cruel, mocking smile playing on his lips. "Come to beg for some spare galleons? I heard your family uses rat skins for blankets." The Ravenclaw girls giggled nervously. Severus stopped 10 paces away. His pale face was an unreadable, emotionless mask. "The Black family name is built on cowardice and inherited gold," Severus said, his voice quiet, yet carrying effortlessly across the silent, wind-swept courtyard. "You are nothing but a pathetic, arrogant dog playing dress-up." Sirius's mocking smile vanished instantly, replaced by a flush of aristocratic fury. His gray eyes flashed dangerously. "You filthy little half-blood freak," Sirius snarled, raising his wand. "I'll teach you to speak to your betters." "Levi Corpus," Sirius shouted, attempting to use the nonverbal spell Severus had actually invented, having somehow stolen the incantation. But Severus had anticipated the attack. He didn't bother with a shield charm. He drew his mother's ebony wand with blinding speed, a movement honed by hours of obsessive, solitary practice in the attic of Spinner's End. "Confringo," Severus roared. He didn't aim for Sirius's chest. He aimed directly at the priceless, goblin-wrought silver watch clutched in Sirius's left hand. The blasting curse struck the silver timepiece with the force of a magical grenade. The explosion was deafening, a brilliant flash of orange heat and concussive force that shattered the silence of the courtyard. The priceless watch detonated into 1,000 pieces of jagged, molten shrapnel. Sirius screamed in absolute agony as the blast ripped through his hand, tearing his flesh and sending him crashing backward onto the cold cobblestones. The sheer force of the explosion knocked James and Peter off their feet as well. The courtyard erupted into utter chaos. Students shrieked and scattered, terrified of the smoke and the smell of burnt flesh and ozone. Sirius lay on the ground, clutching his mangled, bleeding left hand to his chest, his face pale with shock and pain. The aristocratic arrogance was entirely gone, replaced by the humiliating reality of severe physical trauma. James scrambled to his knees, his face pale with terror, shouting for a teacher as he looked at the blood pooling on the stones. Severus Snape did not run. He stood perfectly still amidst the swirling smoke, his ebony wand lowered but still thrumming with residual dark energy. He looked down at the bleeding, broken air of the noble and most ancient House of Black. The message was delivered. Wealth could be burned. Privilege could be shattered. And the half-blood prince was absolutely, undeniably untouchable. Severus turned his back on the screaming boy and walked calmly back toward the dungeons. The war had officially escalated, and the prince had just drawn his first real blood. The restricted section of the Hogwarts library did not merely hold books, it held captive entities. The air behind the heavy, wrought-iron grills was noticeably colder, thick with the scent of decaying leather, dried blood, and the metallic tang of ancient, localized curses. For Severus Snape, it was the most welcoming room in the entire castle. Following his public, devastating retaliation against Sirius Black, Severus had been granted a rare pass to the restricted section by Professor Slughorn, who was entirely too eager to cultivate the boy's undeniable, if terrifying, genius in potions. But Severus was not researching the draft of living death. He was hunting for ghosts. It was well past midnight. The only light came from the pale, floating orb of his Lumos charm, casting long, distorted shadows across the towering shelves. He pulled a massive, iron-clasped tome from the dust-choked upper shelf, Nature's Nobility, a genealogical history of wizarding lineages. He carried the heavy book to a small reading desk and dropped it with a dull thud. He bypassed the chapters dedicated to the Potters, the Blacks, and the Malfoys, names that practically bled arrogance off the parchment. He flipped relentlessly through the heavy vellum pages until he found the crest he had memorized from the tarnished brass box in the suffocating attic of Spinner's End. 2 crossed wands over a shield, flanked by serpents. The most ancient and noble house of Prince. Severus leaned in, his dark, bottomless eyes devouring the text. The princes, he learned, were not loud, boisterous politicians like the Gryffindor elites. They were silent, lethal scholars. They were master potioneers who had supplied poisons to kings and antidotes to emperors. They hoarded their wealth, their secrets, and their bloodline with a paranoid, ruthless efficiency. He traced the intricate family tree depicted in shimmering, silver ink. He saw the names of his ancestors. Septimus Prince, who authored the first treatise on undetectable toxins. Octavia Prince, who served on the Wisengamot and ruthlessly pushed for the segregation of Muggle-borns. Then, his finger traced the line down to the bottom of the page. Eileen Prince. The name was there, but it was violently scorched. A black, jagged burn mark marred the silver ink, severing her connection to the rest of the tree. The text beside the burn mark was brief, clinical, and devastating. Disowned 1960. Blood traitor. Married Tobias Snape, Muggle. Stricken from the registry. Severus stared at the scorch mark. He felt a phantom echo of the physical blow his mother must have taken when her family cast her out to the wolves. Because she loved a Muggle, she was stripped of her gold, her status, and her dignity, exiled to a rotting industrial town in Pennsylvania to be beaten and starved. A cold, absolute hatred settled deep in the marrow of his bones. He hated the Prince family for their cruelty, but simultaneously, he coveted their power. He was a half-blood. He carried the filth of Tobias Snape in his veins, but he also carried the genius of Septimus and the ruthlessness of Octavia. He closed the heavy tome, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent library. He would not remain the bastard son of Cokeworth. He would rip the wealth and the title from the dead hands of his ancestors. He would cross the Atlantic, break whatever archaic magic bound the family vault, and reclaim the crown his mother had squandered. The Pennsylvania winter was a brutal, ugly season. The snow did not fall in pristine, magical drifts like it did over the Scottish Highlands. It fell as a heavy, gray slush that immediately turned black from the soot of the steel mills. The wind howling off the river battered the thin, drafty walls of number 19, Spinner's End, turning the interior of the row house into an icebox. Severus sat at the cramped kitchen table, a chipped mug of bitter black coffee warming his pale, spider-like hands. Across from him, Eileen was nervously darning a pair of ragged socks. The house was dead quiet. Tobias was asleep in his recliner in the other room, his mind permanently dulled and broken by the subtle, persistent memory charms Severus had subjected him to over the summer. "I found the registry," Severus stated, his voice slicing through the cold silence of the kitchen. Eileen's needle paused in midair. She didn't look up, but her thin shoulders tensed. "Registry?" she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "In the Hogwarts library," Severus continued, his tone clinical and unyielding. "I read the history of the Prince family. I saw the scorch mark where your father blasted you off the tapestry." Eileen dropped the sock and the needle onto the table, wrapping her arms tightly around herself as if trying to hold her frail body together. "Leave it alone, Severus. That life is dead. They're all dead. My father passed away 5 years ago. There is no one left to appeal to." "I am not interested in an appeal," Severus said, his dark eyes fixed on her pale, haunted face. "I am interested in what belongs to me. A family that old, that paranoid, did not simply leave their wealth to the ministry." "Where is the vault, Mother?" Eileen shook her head frantically. "You can't. It's at Gringotts, but you can't touch it. When my father disowned me, he invoked a blood ward on the vault doors. It wasn't just a legal disinheritance, Severus. It was dark magic. He commanded the goblin locks to reject the magical signature of Eileen Snape. If I even touch the iron of that vault, the curses will burn me to ash." Severus leaned forward, the gears of his brilliant, obsessive mind turning rapidly. He had spent the entire semester researching the theory of blood magic. He warded it against Snape, Severus murmured, dissecting the phrasing. He warded it against the blood traitor. Yes, Eileen sobbed, burying her face in her hands. He locked it away forever. No, Severus corrected, a terrifying, predatory smile curving his lips. He locked you out. He commanded the magic to reject the daughter who tainted her blood. But magic is literal, Mother. It is blind to intent. It only obeys the precise parameters of the spell. Eileen looked up, her tear-streaked face thoroughly confused. What do you mean? Severus stood up, his dark robes swirling around his ankles. I am not Snape. I am not the daughter who ran away. I am the son who returned. My blood is tainted, yes, but it is undeniably Prince blood. And I have spent the last 2 years proving that my magic is darker, sharper, and more powerful than anything your father ever possessed. He walked toward the kitchen door, his mind already calculating the transatlantic portkey schedules and the phases of the moon required for the counter-curse. I am going to London, Severus declared, looking back at his broken mother. And I am going to break the bank. Before leaving for London, Severus needed specific potion ingredients that could only be found in the seedy underbelly of the American magical black market. He wrapped a heavy, black wool coat tightly around himself and stepped out into the freezing slush of Spinner's End. The sky was the color of bruised iron. The neighborhood was desolate, the factory workers huddled inside their rotting homes around cheap space heaters. As Severus walked down the cracked sidewalk, his breath pluming in the freezing air, he saw a pristine, powder-blue Chevrolet pull up to the curb a few houses down. The door opened, and Petunia Evans stepped out. She was dressed in an immaculate, cream-colored winter coat with a faux fur collar, looking entirely ridiculous and obscenely out of place in the industrial filth of Cokeworth. She was home for the holidays from her secretarial college, radiating an aura of desperate, manufactured middle-class superiority. Severus stopped. He watched her pull a brightly wrapped Christmas present from the back seat, her nose wrinkled in perpetual disgust at the smell of the nearby river. Petunia slammed the car door and turned, freezing when she saw him standing 20 feet away. For a moment, they simply stared at each other through the falling gray snow. Petunia's pale eyes swept over his sallow face, his lank black hair, and his dark, imposing coat. She didn't see the little boy in oversized, ragged clothes anymore. But her ingrained arrogance demanded she assert her dominance over the trash of Spinner's End. Well, Petunia sneered, her voice dripping with venomous disdain. If it isn't the neighborhood freak. Come out of your rat hole for the holidays, Snape? I suppose Lily is too busy with her normal friends to waste time with you down by the river. Severus felt the familiar, hot spike of anger, but he didn't react like he used to. He didn't snap a dead branch or yell insults. He had evolved far beyond the petty skirmishes of children. He was a practitioner of the dark arts. He understood that true terror was silent. He didn't pull his wand. He simply locked his bottomless, obsidian eyes onto hers and stepped off the sidewalk, walking slowly and deliberately toward her. He projected his magic outward, not as a physical kinetic force, but as an aura. He channeled the freezing, suffocating dread of the dungeons, the visceral horror of the Sectum Semper curse, and the absolute, paralyzing authority he wielded over his own father. The air around Severus seemed to warp and darken. The temperature plummeted unnaturally, freezing the slush beneath his boots into solid, cracking ice. Petunia's smug sneer faltered. She took a step back, her back hitting the side of the Chevrolet. She opened her mouth to hurl another insult, but her throat seized. A primal, suffocating panic gripped her chest. She wasn't looking at a boy from a poor neighborhood anymore. She was looking at a predator, a monster born of shadows and malice. Severus stopped 2 feet away from her. He towered over her now. He didn't say a single word. He simply let her feel the suffocating weight of his power. He let her realize, with absolute certainty, that with a single thought, he could stop her heart. Petunia dropped the Christmas present into the slush. Her whole body began to tremble violently, her pale eyes wide with abject terror. She whimpered, a pathetic, animalistic sound, completely stripped of her Muggle superiority. Severus tilted his head slightly, studying her fear with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing an insect. A thin, cruel smile touched his lips. "Run along, Petunia," Severus whispered, his voice as cold as the grave. "Before I decide the air you breathe is an insult to me." Petunia scrambled frantically around the hood of the car, her pristine coat dragging in the black slush, and bolted down the street toward her parents' house, sobbing in terror. Severus looked down at the ruined present in the snow. He stepped on it, crushing the bright red bough beneath the heel of his boot, and continued his walk toward the slag heap. The Muggles were officially broken. Now it was time to break the purebloods. Diagon Alley in late December was a frozen, glittering spectacle, packed with wealthy witches and wizards doing their holiday shopping. Severus bypassed the cheerful storefronts of Madame Malkin's and Flourish and Blot's, heading straight for the looming, crooked white marble structure at the end of the street. Gringotts Wizarding Bank. He ascended the grand marble steps, nodding curtly to the heavily armed goblin guards at the bronze doors. The interior of the bank was a cavernous hall of polished marble, echoing with the clinking of galleons and the scratching of 100 goblin quills. Severus walked confidently to the highest teller's desk. He did not look like a boy seeking a student loan. He projected the cold, aristocratic authority he had studied from Lucius Malfoy, mixed with the lethal stillness of the dark arts. The old goblin behind the desk peered down over his spectacles, his long fingers pausing over his ledger. "Name?" the goblin rasped, his voice like grinding stones. "Severus Snape," he answered smoothly. "I am here to claim the contents of Vault 394, the Prince family vault." The goblin's eyes narrowed into slits. He pulled a heavy, dust-covered ledger from beneath his desk and flipped through the thick parchment pages. He stopped, tracing a long, clawed finger down the page. "The Prince vault was sealed in 1960 by order of Corvus Prince," the goblin sneered, looking back down at Severus with open hostility. "The primary heir, Eileen Prince, was disowned. The vault is locked under a blood ward. We do not grant access to bastards or blood traitors." "I am neither," Severus said, his voice dropping into a dangerously low register. "I am the direct descendant, and I claim the right of challenge against the ward." The goblin stared at him, genuinely surprised. The right of challenge was an archaic, highly dangerous magical loophole. If a descendant believed the blood ward was flawed, or that their own magical signature was strong enough to overpower the ancestor's curse, they could attempt to open the vault. If they failed, the ward would incinerate them on the spot. "Very well," the goblin grinned, a terrifying display of needle-sharp teeth. "If you wish to turn yourself to ash in our caverns, the bank will not stop you. Griphook, take this one to Vault 394. The journey down into the subterranean depths of Gringotts was a blur of rushing wind and plunging darkness. The cart rattled violently along the narrow tracks, passing roaring waterfalls and deep, abyssal chasms. They descended deeper than the standard family vaults, down into the oldest, most heavily guarded sections of the bank where the ancient pureblood families hoarded their legacies. The cart screeched to a halt on a narrow stone ledge before a massive, solid iron door. There was no keyhole. The center of the iron door was dominated by a large, rusted crest, the crossed wands and serpents of the Prince family. "The vault is sealed by blood," Griphook stated, stepping back and gesturing to the door with a cruel sneer. "The ward commands that no tainted blood shall pass. Proceed, half-blood." Severus stepped up to the massive iron door. He could feel the ancient curse radiating from the metal, a heavy, suffocating pressure that tasted like copper and burning ozone. It was designed to detect the Muggle taint in his veins and destroy him for it. He didn't pull his wand. The ward could not be broken by spells. It had to be broken by authority. Severus reached into his coat and pulled out a small, silver dagger he had purchased in the American underground. He took a deep breath, focusing his mind, pulling every ounce of his hatred, his ambition, and his dark magic to the very surface of his skin. He had to convince the ancient magic that the power of the Prince family had not died with his mother's disgrace. It had evolved into something far more dangerous. He placed his left hand flat against the freezing iron crest. With his right hand, he drove the silver blade across his palm. A sharp hiss escaped his lips as the blood welled up, bright and crimson, smearing across the rusted serpents. Immediately, the iron door began to glow with a blinding, violent red light. The air in the cavern superheated, and a deafening, high-pitched shrieking sound echoed off the stone walls as the ancient curse woke up, detecting the blood of Tobias Snape. Severus felt the heat searing into his palm. The curse was trying to burn him alive from the inside out. "No!" Severus roared in his mind, executing a massive, brutal push of raw legitimacy, projecting his sheer will against the magical construct of the door. "I am the prince. I am the heir. The old blood is weak. My blood is power." He forced his dark magic, the kinetic force that through his father, the cutting malice of Sectum Sempra, the terrifying chill that broke Petunia Evans into the iron. He met the ancient curse with a modern, vicious darkness that his ancestors could never have comprehended. For 10 agonizing seconds, the cavern was bathed in a blinding war of red and black magic. The iron door groaned, vibrating violently under the pressure. Severus's knees buckled, his teeth gritted in agony, but he did not remove his hand. Suddenly, with a sound like a thunderclap, the red light shattered. The ancient shrieking died instantly. The heavy iron door clicked, the massive internal tumblers disengaging with a series of heavy, echoing thuds. The door slowly swung open, groaning on rusted hinges. Severus dropped to his knees on the stone ledge, clutching his bleeding hand to his chest, gasping for air. His dark eyes stared into the cavernous space beyond the door. He had done it. He had broken the disownment. He stood up, his legs shaking, and walked into Vault 394. The light from Griphook's torch revealed mountains of tarnished silver galleons, heavy gold ingots, and shelves lined with priceless, ancient grimoires bound in dragon hide. There were velvet-lined boxes holding cursed jewels, and rows of pristine, rare potion ingredients sealed in crystal vials. It was an empire of wealth and dark knowledge. Severus turned to the stunned goblin, his pale, sweat-drenched face breaking into a terrifying, victorious smile. "I require a bottomless satchel, Griphook. I have shopping to do." When Severus Snape returned to the Slytherin dungeons for the spring term, the transformation was absolute. The heavy, oak door to the common room swung open, and the usual low hum of pureblood plotting died instantly. Every eye in the room turned to the entrance. Severus did not walk, he commanded the space. He had shed the last remnants of the impoverished boy from Cokeworth. He was dressed in magnificent, custom-tailored robes of deep, midnight black acromantula silk. The fabric shimmered like liquid obsidian in the green light of the dungeon. His boots were polished dragon hide, and around his neck, resting against his black shirt, was a heavy silver amulet bearing the crossed wands and serpents of the prince crest. His lank, greasy hair was gone, replaced by sleek, dark locks that framed his pale, sharply angled face. The dark circles under his eyes remained, but they no longer looked like signs of exhaustion. They looked like the marks of a wizard who spent his nights communing with forces others were too terrified to name. Avery and Mulciber, lounging by the fireplace, practically choked on their butterbeer. They stared at the fortune Severus was wearing, their arrogant pureblood sneers utterly wiped away by shock. Severus walked smoothly into the center of the room. He didn't carry a second-hand trunk. A brand-new, ebony wood trunk heavily banded in silver floated effortlessly behind him, guided by his silent, wandless command. He spotted Lucius Malfoy sitting in a high-backed leather chair, a goblet of wine in his hand. Malfoy's pale gray eyes widened slightly, a genuine look of surprise crossing his usually unreadable aristocratic features. Severus stopped in front of the fire, looking down at Avery and Mulciber. He didn't speak a word. He didn't have to. The sheer weight of his presence, backed by the undeniable wealth of an ancient lineage and the terrifying reputation of his dark magic, forced them to yield. Slowly, instinctively, Avery shifted, moving his legs to clear the largest, most ornate leather armchair by the fire, the unofficial throne of the most powerful student in the year. Severus took the seat. He draped his long, silk-clad legs gracefully, resting his hands on the armrests. He felt the cold silver of his family crest pressing against his chest. He had the gold. He had the bloodline. He had the arsenal of spells locked inside his journal. Lucius Malfoy raised his goblet in a silent, respectful toast. "Welcome back, Prince." Severus offered a microscopic nod. He looked into the roaring green flames of the fireplace, his mind already turning to the Gryffindor Tower, to the Marauders, and to Lily Evans. He was no longer fighting for survival. He was fighting for total domination. The half-blood prince had claimed his crown, and the reign of terror was about to begin. The June sun beat down upon the grounds of Hogwarts, casting a brilliant, shimmering glare over the surface of the Black Lake. It was the end of their 5th year, and the suffocating tension of the ordinary wizarding level examinations had finally broken, leaving the student body to sprawl across the manicured lawns in a state of exhausted relief. Severus Snape did not sprawl. He sat beneath the sprawling branches of a massive beech tree, entirely cloaked in the shadows. He wore his custom-tailored acromantula silk robes, immune to the summer heat through a subtle cooling charm he had woven into the fabric. His dark eyes were fixed on his leather-bound journal, his quills scratching violently as he made the final arithmetic adjustments to the Sectum Semper curse. He had the wealth of the Prince family, he had the respect of the Slytherin elite, but the war against the Marauders remained a bitter, unresolved stalemate. A burst of loud, obnoxious laughter drifted across the grass. Severus looked up, his quill freezing on the parchment. 50 yards away, sitting by the edge of the water, were James Potter, Sirius Black, Remus Lupin, and Peter Pettigrew. James was casually tossing a golden snitch into the air and catching it, ruffling his already messy hair to ensure he looked perfectly windswept for the group of girls sitting nearby. Among those girls, laughing at something James had just said, was Lily Evans. The sight of her sitting so comfortably with his tormentors felt like a serrated blade twisting in his gut. He snapped his journal shut, slipping it into his inner pocket alongside his mother's ebony wand. He stood up, intending to retreat to the cool, dark sanctuary of the Slytherin dungeons. He didn't want a confrontation today. His mind was entirely consumed by the dark magic equations he had just solved. But Sirius Black's sharp, aristocratic eyes caught the movement in the shadows. "Look who it is," Sirius announced, his voice carrying effortlessly over the gentle lapping of the lake water. "The Prince of the Dungeons." James caught the snitch and pocketed it, turning to look at Severus. The white scar on James's cheekbone, the mark Severus had carved into him years ago, stood out starkly against his tanned skin. A cruel, familiar spark ignited in James's hazel eyes. He stood up, drawing his wand. "Excellent. I was getting incredibly bored." Severus froze, his hand instantly dropping to his pocket. He was a brilliant duelist, and his arsenal of dark magic was formidable, but he was alone in broad daylight, surrounded by dozens of students. "Expelliarmus!" James shouted, the spell tearing across the grass before Severus could fully clear his wand from his silk robes. The ebony wand flew from Severus's grip, clattering uselessly onto the grass 10 feet away. Sirius barked a laugh, stepping up beside James. "Impedimenta!" Sirius cast, a blast of kinetic force slamming into Severus's chest and knocking him flat onto his back, knocking the wind out of his lungs. The surrounding students gasped, some turning away, while others edged closer, eager for the spectacle. Severus scrambled, his pale hands desperately clawing at the grass, trying to reach his wand. The humiliation burned through his veins like liquid fire. He was the half-blood prince. He had broken the ancient wards of Gringotts. He had subjugated his Muggle father. He could not be reduced to this helpless, sprawling target. "Levi Corpus!" James yelled, executing the very spell Severus had invented. Severus was violently hoisted into the air by his left ankle. The world inverted sickeningly. His expensive silk robes cascaded over his head, exposing his pale, thin legs and gray undergarments to the bright sunlight and the pointing, laughing crowd. The blood rushed to his head, his face burning with a shame so absolute and profound it felt like dying. "Who wants to see me take off Snevelus's trousers?" James shouted to the crowd, his wand twirling maliciously. "Leave him alone." The voice cut through the laughter like a whip. Severus, hanging upside down, his vision blurred by his heavy robes and the rushing blood, saw a flash of brilliant, fiery red hair push through the crowd. Lily Evans marched right up to James Potter, her green eyes blazing with absolute, unfiltered fury. "Let him down, James. You are an arrogant, bullying toerag. Leave him alone." "Come on, Evans, it's just a bit of fun," James said, though his wand wavered slightly under her intense glare. He ran a hand through his hair, attempting a charming smile that failed completely. "Let him down," she demanded, pulling her own wand. James sighed, a theatrical display of surrender. He flicked his wand, muttering the counter-curse. Severus crashed to the ground in a heap of tangled silk and humiliated pride. He scrambled to his knees, snatching his ebony wand from the grass. He was shaking violently. The world was spinning, his ears ringing with the fading laughter of the crowd and the sound of Lily's voice defending him. He looked at her. She was standing over him, her hand outstretched to help him up, a look of deep pity and sorrow etched into her beautiful features. Pity. It was the one thing Severus Snape could not survive. It was the look the shopkeepers in Cokeworth gave his mother. It was the look that confirmed he was weak, that he was a victim, that despite all his dark magic and ancient gold, he was still just the pathetic boy from the dying American mill town who needed a girl to save him from the playground bullies. His pride, fragile and volatile, shattered into a million jagged pieces. The dark, consuming rage that he had nurtured for years completely overrode his intellect and his heart. He slapped her outstretched hand away violently. He scrambled to his feet, his dark eyes burning with an unholy, cornered fury. "I don't need help from filthy little mudbloods like her," Severus roared. The word left his lips before he could stop it. It echoed across the lawn, sharp and devastating. The silence that followed was absolute. The laughter died instantly. Even James and Sirius looked shocked. It was the ultimate, unforgivable slur of the pureblood supremacists, the exact ideology Lily despised. Severus saw the immediate, devastating impact. Lily's face went completely pale, her green eyes widening in shock and a profound, shattering heartbreak. The pity vanished, replaced by a cold, absolute finality. "Fine," Lily whispered, her voice devoid of any warmth. "I won't bother in the future. And I'd wash your pants if I were you, Snavellis." She turned her back on him and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Severus stood frozen on the grass, his ebony wand trembling in his grip. The sun was still shining, but the world had plunged into total, suffocating darkness. He had fired the ultimate curse, and in doing so, he had destroyed the only sanctuary he had ever truly loved. The stone corridor outside the Gryffindor common room was bitterly cold. It was long past curfew, the castle wrapped in a heavy, oppressive silence. Severus had been standing in the shadows, near the portrait of the fat lady, for 3 hours. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't slept. The word he had spoken by the lake played on a continuous, agonizing loop in his mind, echoing with the horrifying finality of a judge's gavel. Finally, the portrait hole swung open. Lily stepped out, her arms wrapped tightly around her dressing gown. Her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen from crying, but her posture was rigid with a new, unyielding strength. Severus stepped out of the shadows. "Lily." She stopped, but she didn't step back. She looked at him, and the expression in her bright green eyes made his chest physically ache. There was no warmth left. There was no memory of the rusted playground in Pennsylvania, or the shared wonder of the Hogwarts Express. There was only the cold, hard realization of what he had become. "I'm sorry," Severus said, the words tearing their way out of his throat. He had never apologized to anyone in his entire life, but for her, he would beg. "I'm sorry. I never meant to call you that. It just slipped out. I was humiliated. I was angry. Slipped out," Lily repeated, her voice perfectly steady, slicing through his desperate excuses. "It's not just a word, Severus. It's an entire way of looking at the world. It's too late. I've made excuses for you for years. None of my friends can understand why I even talk to you." "Your friends?" Severus scoffed, a brief, defensive flare of anger rising before he quickly pushed it down. "You mean Potter and his arrogant gang? They attacked me, Lily. They hung me upside down in front of half the school. And what do you do to people in the corridors at night?" Lily fired back, stepping closer, her voice dropping to an intense, furious whisper. "I know about the dark magic you practice, Severus. I know what you and Avery and Mulciber do. You think I haven't heard the rumors about the spells you are inventing? Spells designed to permanently injure people." Severus fell silent, his jaw tightening. "You've chosen your path," Lily said, shaking her head slowly. "You chose Lucius Malfoy. You chose the Death Eaters. You chose a worldview that explicitly hates me and everything I am. You call every one of my birth mudbloods, Severus. Why should I be any different? You are different," Severus pleaded, taking a desperate step forward. "You are everything. I only wanted the power so they couldn't hurt us anymore. So I could protect you." "I don't want your protection," Lily said, her voice finally cracking, a single tear spilling over her eyelashes. "Because the only thing I need protecting from right now is you." She turned around and climbed back through the portrait hole. The heavy painting swung shut with a resounding click, sealing her away in the warm, red and gold light of Gryffindor Tower, leaving Severus locked out in the cold, dark stone of the corridor. Severus did not cry. Crying was a weakness he had burned out of himself years ago in the suffocating pantry of Cokeworth. Instead, he felt a profound, terrifying numbness spread from his chest, freezing his veins. The last tether holding him to his humanity had just been severed. There was no longer a reason to hold back the dark magic. There was no longer a reason to hide his hatred for the Marauders or his ambition for total supremacy. The boy who had loved Lily Evans died in that corridor, leaving only the half-blood prince. And the prince was finally ready for war. The summer before his 6th year, Severus Snape returned to Pennsylvania for the final time. He did not walk from the portkey drop point. He operated directly into the living room of number 19, Spinner's End. The loud, sharp crack of displaced air echoed like a gunshot in the cramped, grimy house. The suffocating July heat was exactly the same. The smell of stale beer and damp rot was exactly the same. But Severus was entirely different. He wore his black silk robes, his silver prince crest resting heavily against his chest, his dark eyes devoid of any lingering childhood fear. Tobias Snape was standing in the kitchen doorway. He held a half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey in his hand. The subtle memory charms Severus had woven into his father's mind over the years had begun to fracture under the weight of the alcohol. Tobias's broad, weathered face was red, a desperate, pathetic flare of his old, abusive arrogance attempting to resurface. "You," Tobias slurred, taking a heavy, uncoordinated step into the living room. "You think you're a big man now, walking in here with your fancy clothes. This is my house. I'm the man of this house." Tobias raised the heavy glass bottle, his muscles tensing to swing it at his son's head. It was the same motion that had terrorized Severus and Eileen for a decade. It was the motion that defined the Muggle world's brutal, primitive authority. Severus did not flinch. He did not draw his wand. He simply looked at the massive, sweating man with an expression of profound, absolute boredom. Severus flicked his wrist. The whiskey bottle shattered in Tobias's hand, the heavy glass disintegrating into a fine, harmless powder. Tobias shouted in shock, staring at his empty, stinging palm. Before Tobias could react, Severus raised his right hand, his fingers slightly curled. He channeled the localized freezing charm he had perfected on his very first day of rebellion, but he laced it with the dark, heavy pressure he had used to break the Gringotts' wards. "Immobulus Maxima," Severus whispered. A wave of dense, freezing blue energy slammed into Tobias. The Muggle froze instantly, his body locking into rigid, painful paralysis. His eyes widened in absolute, suffocating terror as he was forced to stand perfectly still, trapped in his own body. Severus walked slowly toward him. He didn't want to just punish the man. He wanted to permanently excise the threat. He wanted to complete his revenge on the rotting American town that had tried to bury him. Severus placed the pale, long fingers of his left hand directly against Tobias's sweating, paralyzed forehead. He drove his mind forward, executing a brutal, sustained Legilimens invasion. He didn't just read his father's memories, he dismantled them. He found the core of Tobias's aggressive pride, the memories of his strength, the satisfaction he felt when he hit Eileen, the arrogant belief that he was the master of his domain. With the clinical precision of a surgeon holding a scalpel, Severus carved those memories out of his father's brain and incinerated them. Tobias couldn't scream, but a single, agonizing tear leaked from his frozen eye as his identity was systematically shredded. Severus replaced the aggression with an overwhelming, permanent sense of profound apathy and submissive fear. He rewired the Muggle's neural pathways until Tobias Snape was nothing more than a hollow, breathing shell. Severus broke the mental connection and snapped his fingers, releasing the freezing charm. Tobias collapsed onto his knees. He didn't look up. He didn't speak. He simply stared at the yellowed linoleum floor, his jaw slack, a line of drool pooling at the corner of his mouth. The beast of Spinner's End was dead, leaving only an empty vessel behind. Eileen stepped out from the kitchen shadows, her hands trembling as she looked at her husband. "Pack your things, mother," Severus commanded, turning his back on the broken man on the floor. "We are leaving this pathetic country. The Prince Vault has enough gold to buy a manor in the British countryside. You will never have to look at him or this filth ever again." Severus walked out the front door, stepping onto the cracked asphalt of Cokeworth for the absolute last time. The air still tasted of copper and smog, but for the first time in his life, he took a deep breath and felt entirely, blissfully free. The private study of Malfoy Manor was a masterclass in dark, ancient opulence. The walls were lined with towering bookshelves containing tomes deemed too dangerous even for the Hogwarts restricted section. A massive crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling, casting a cold, diamond-like light over the heavy mahogany furniture and the priceless, cursed artifacts resting in glass display cases. Severus stood by the massive, roaring fireplace, holding a crystal tumbler of fire whiskey he had no intention of drinking. It was the winter of his 6th year. His reputation at Hogwarts had solidified into legend. He was the undisputed master of the Slytherin dungeons, the brilliant potioneer who had reinvented half the standard curriculum, and the silent, terrifying duelist who had scarred James Potter and blown up Sirius Black's hand. But he was completely hollow inside. The vengeance he had wreaked upon the Muggles and the power he had seized in the castle had not filled the void Lily Evans had left behind. The heavy mahogany doors swung open. Lucius Malfoy entered, looking immaculate in robes of silver and deep emerald. He had graduated from Hogwarts 2 years prior, fully ascending to his role as the wealthy, influential patriarch of the Malfoy family. Lucius walked to the crystal decanter on his desk and poured himself a glass. "You requested an audience, Severus. I must admit I am pleased. I have been watching your development with great interest." Severus turned to face the older wizard. He did not adopt the deferential posture of a student. He stood with the straight-backed, arrogant posture of a pure-blood equal. "You told me in my second year that your circles were looking for exceptional talent. You spoke of a new order. A world where power is not restricted by pathetic ministry laws or the sentimental whims of Muggle sympathizers." Lucius smiled, a slow, predatory curving of his thin lips. He set his glass down and walked toward Severus, his pale gray eyes gleaming with dark anticipation. "You have excised the weaknesses from your life, Severus. I heard about your final confrontation with the Mudblood girl. A necessary severing. Attachments to the unworthy only drag a wizard of your caliber down into the mud." Severus's jaw tightened imperceptibly at the mention of Lily, but his face remained a cold, emotionless mask. "I have no attachments. I have only ambition." "Excellent," Lucius purred. "The Dark Lord is gathering his forces. We are no longer simply a political movement whispering in the shadows, Severus. We are an army preparing to cleanse this world. The old, wealthy families like the Potters and the Blacks who coddle the Muggles will be swept away. The Mudbloods who pollute our ancient halls will be eradicated. And those who stand with the Dark Lord will be granted power beyond their wildest comprehension." Lucius reached out, placing a firm, patronizing hand on Severus's shoulder. "You have the blood of the princes, but you have the mind of a revolutionary. You invented curses that even the Dark Lord's inner circle find fascinating. Swear your allegiance, Severus. Give your genius to the cause, and the Dark Lord will give you the authority to crush anyone who has ever mocked you. James Potter and his arrogant friends will kneel before you, begging for mercy." Severus stared into the roaring flames of the fireplace. James Potter kneeling before him. The image was intoxicating. It was the ultimate culmination of the vow he had made in the cramped, suffocating attic in Pennsylvania. He had conquered his father. He had reclaimed his gold. Now he would join an empire that would allow him to conquer the entire world. Severus turned his bottomless, dark eyes back to Lucius Malfoy. "Where do I sign?" The initiation did not take place in a grand manor or a heavily warded castle. It took place in the damp, decaying ruins of an abandoned abbey on the desolate coast of Scotland, hidden beneath a sky choked with heavy black storm clouds. It was a place that smelled of ancient death and raw, untamed magic. Severus stood in the center of the ruined sanctuary, surrounded by a circle of figures cloaked in heavy black robes, their faces hidden behind terrifying bone-white silver masks. The air vibrated with a dark, heavy pressure that made his skin crawl, and his magic surged defensively in his veins. He was 18 years old. He had graduated from Hogwarts a few weeks prior, entirely alone, leaving behind a legacy of fear and brilliance. At the head of the sanctuary stood a figure wrapped in absolute, suffocating darkness. Severus could not see his face, but he could feel the sheer, overwhelming magnitude of the wizard's power. It was a power that made the kinetic shockwaves and severing curses Severus had invented feel like child's play. It was the power of a god. "Severus Snape," a voice hissed from the darkness. It was high, cold, and completely devoid of humanity. It slid into Severus's mind like an icy dagger, bypassing his formidable occlumency shields with terrifying ease. "The Half-Blood Prince. Lucius has spoken highly of your cruelty and your intellect. I offer my mind and my magic to your service, my lord," Severus said, his voice steady, though his heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He dropped to one knee on the damp, moss-covered stone floor, bowing his head in total submission. "You harbor a great deal of hatred, Severus," Lord Voldemort murmured, stepping closer. A pale, long-fingered hand emerged from the heavy black robes. "Hatred for the Muggle filth that birthed you. Hatred for the arrogant purebloods who look down upon you. That hatred is a powerful fuel. But to serve me, you must refine it. You must become a weapon that strikes not out of anger, but out of absolute obedience." I am your weapon, my lord, Severus swore. Extend your left arm, Voldemort commanded. Severus pulled up the sleeve of his black silk robe, exposing his pale forearm to the freezing Scottish wind. Voldemort drew a wand that looked as pale and deadly as carved bone. He pressed the tip of the wand directly into the flesh of Severus's inner arm. More Smordra, Voldemort whispered. The pain was instantaneous and absolute. It was not the stinging slap of a hex or the dull ache of a physical blow. It was a searing, white-hot agony that felt as though molten iron was being injected directly into his veins. Severus gasped, his teeth gritted so hard his jaw cracked. His muscles locked, trembling violently, but he forced himself not to pull away. He forced himself to endure the branding. Black ink, thick and writhing like living shadows, began to burn its way into his skin. It spiraled and twisted, forming the shape of a massive, menacing skull. From the open, screaming mouth of the skull, a thick, venomous serpent slithered outward, etching itself permanently into his flesh. The agony peaked in a blinding flash, and then the wand was removed. Severus remained on his knee, his chest heaving, his left arm throbbing with a dark, pulsing heat that synced perfectly with his heartbeat. He slowly looked down at his arm. The dark mark stared back at him, pitch black and violently fresh against his pale skin. It was a brand of servitude, yes, but to Severus, it was the final, undeniable proof of his ascendance. He was no longer the frightened boy hiding from a drunken Muggle in a dying American town. He was no longer the outcast student desperate for the affection of a Gryffindor girl who could never truly understand his darkness. He was a Death Eater. He was the half-blood prince. Severus stood up, pulling his sleeve down to conceal the dark magic burned into his skin. He looked at the masked figures surrounding him, and then up at the dark, imposing silhouette of the Dark Lord. The path of vengeance had consumed everything he held dear, just as the Sorting Hat had warned. But as the Scottish storm broke overhead, unleashing a torrential downpour upon the ruined abbey, Severus Snape felt no regret. He felt only the cold, sharp, and absolute certainty of his own immense power. The world had tried to break him, and in response, he would help burn it to the ground. And so, the half-blood prince claims his dark throne. But we need to know where you stand on his descent into the dark arts. Was Snape's ruthless path to power completely justified after the trauma and bullying he endured? Or did he go way too far and become the exact monster he hated?